Hey guys, tonight we step into a cooling medieval evening where smoke curls lazily above straw hives, bees thrum like a living lullaby, and you stand very still, hoping your modern instincts don't betray you, because honestly, you probably won't survive this without learning to calm down first. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments too. It's always quietly amazing to see where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing just outside a small medieval settlement, the kind that doesn't bother naming itself on maps because everyone who needs to know already does. The air smells faintly of damp earth, wood smoke, and something sweet you can't quite place yet. That sweetness floats from a cluster of straw domes resting on low wooden benches near a garden fence. These are skeps, woven beehives, simple, rounded, and humming with life. You feel the vibration more than you hear it, a soft collective whisper that makes the evening feel alive rather than empty. Your first instinct, being you, is to lean closer. Bad move. A medieval beekeeper clears his throat behind you, not sharply, not angrily, just enough to remind you that curiosity needs manners here. The first lesson, you realize, is restraint. Medieval beekeeping is not about control, it's about negotiation. You don't rush bees, you don't surprise them, you certainly don't swat at them like you're at a summer barbecue in 2026. You breathe, you slow down, you let the bees decide whether you're worth tolerating. This gentle approach is not accidental. One mainstream historical fact you absorb almost immediately is that medieval beekeepers lacked protective gear. No mesh veils, no gloves, no reassuring YouTube tutorials titled Top 5 Beginner Beekeeping Mistakes. What they had instead was experience, patience, and a deep belief that bees responded to calm behavior. Whether or not the bees actually cared about human vibes is another matter, but the practice stuck, and surprisingly, it often worked. The beekeeper crouches and lights a small bundle of smoldering straw mixed with dried herbs. Smoke drifts slowly toward the hive, not choking, not aggressive. This is one of the oldest beekeeping techniques known, used across cultures. The idea is simple. Smoke encourages bees to gorge on honey, making them less likely to sting. Historians still argue whether medieval keepers fully understood the biological reason or whether they simply noticed, over generations, that smoke made things go smoothly and decided not to question success too hard. Honestly, a relatable approach. As the smoke curls, you notice how deliberate everything feels. There's no rush to open anything, no sense of urgency. Bees are treated less like livestock and more like slightly temperamental neighbors. In many medieval communities, bees were believed to have a moral sensitivity. A quirky but widespread belief held that bees could sense dishonesty or ill intent. If your heart wasn't in the right place, the hive would know. This might sound charming now, but it also meant that if you got stung, people quietly wondered what you'd done to deserve it. Medieval victim blaming, but make it pastoral. You listen as the beekeeper murmurs. Not quite words, not quite silence. This isn't ritual exactly, though prayer and practice overlap a lot here. Some keepers spoke to their bees regularly, announcing intentions before approaching the hive. There's debate over whether such speech was meant to calm the bees themselves or reassure the humans performing a risky task. Either way, you feel your shoulders drop as the rhythm of the murmuring settles your breathing. The bees continue their hum, unconcerned. They are not pets, not sacred beings exactly, but something in between. In medieval thought, bees occupy a fascinating mental space, industrious, orderly, productive, and just a little mysterious. You're aware that in this moment, no one here thinks of bees as insects the way you do. That category doesn't quite exist yet. Bees are more like tiny citizens with wings, participants in a shared economy of survival. As twilight deepens, you notice how the garden around the hives is carefully planted. Herbs, flowers and fruit trees cluster nearby. This isn't accidental landscaping. Medieval beekeepers knew, through observation, not textbooks, that bees thrived when forage was close. They didn't talk about pollination in modern scientific terms, but they absolutely understood that healthy bees meant healthy plants and vice versa. One fringe tidbit that floats through local lore claims certain flowers could teach bees better behavior, though no one ever quite agrees on which flowers those were. Lavender? Thyme? Something blue and definitely symbolic. The arguments get surprisingly heated. You shift your weight, realizing how long you've been standing still. Time moves differently here. Without clocks dictating productivity, observation becomes the work. The beekeeper finally straightens and gestures for you to step back, not because of danger, but because that's enough for today. Overexposure is a risk, both for bees and humans. Another quiet rule: always leave before anything goes wrong. Success is measured by absence of incident, not by how much you extract. As you walk away from the hives, the hum fades into the background, blending with evening birds and distant human voices. You feel oddly calm, like your nervous system has taken notes. Medieval beekeeping begins not with tools or techniques, but with attention. You are learning, already, to be less loud in the world. And as ridiculous as it sounds, that might be the most advanced technology you'll encounter all night. You don't leave the bees behind so much as carry them with you, a low echo in your chest as you walk back toward the village paths. The sweetness you noticed earlier becomes clearer now. Honey, yes, but also wax, warm straw, crushed herbs underfoot. You're beginning to understand that bees are not a charming side project here. They are infrastructure. Quiet, flying infrastructure that doesn't ask for wages, but absolutely expects respect. Bread keeps people alive, sure, but bees make life tolerable. That's the unspoken truth you start to sense as doors glow with candlelight and the evening settles in. One mainstream historical fact anchors itself quickly. Honey is the primary sweetener of medieval Europe. There is no cheap sugar pouring in from overseas plantations yet. If you want sweetness in food, drink, or medicine, it comes from bees. Without them, the medieval diet becomes bleak in a way even hard bread can't compensate for. You pause near a household where a woman stirs something thick and fragrant over the fire. Honey dissolves into warmed ale, creating a drink that's part nourishment, part comfort. This isn't a luxury reserved for feasts. Honey shows up everywhere, in sauces, in preserved fruits, even brushed onto roasted meats when someone's feeling ambitious. The bees don't just sweeten food, they soften daily life, and you're realizing that softness matters more than you'd expected. Wax matters just as much, though in a quieter, steadier way. You glance into a small chapel nearby and see candles burning with a clean, steady flame. These aren't tallow candles made from animal fat, which smoke and stink and remind you uncomfortably of what they're made from. Beeswax burns brighter and purer. It's prized for churches, monasteries, and anyone who can afford a little dignity after sunset. The gentle science of beekeeping stretches directly into how long people can read, pray, or simply sit awake without choking on fumes. Bees extend the day. There's a quirky belief circulating as you listen to the villagers talk that bees understand their role in Christian order, that they labor joyfully because God designed them to. This idea turns up in sermons and moral tales, where bees become symbols of ideal society. Everyone works, no one complains, and sweetness is produced through collective effort. It's a flattering comparison for bees and a quietly demanding one for humans. You sense the pressure underneath it, the way moral lessons hitch rides on buzzing wings. Pollination, though not named as such, is another silent miracle unfolding all around you. Orchards near the village thrive year after year, and gardeners know, without graphs or controlled experiments, that bees matter. They notice that where bees vanish, harvests shrink. Historians still argue whether medieval farmers fully grasped the causal relationship or simply accepted it as part of God's will. Either way, bees earned protection through usefulness alone. Practical reverence is still reverence. You follow a narrow lane past gardens fenced with woven hurdles. Flowers are not purely decorative here, they're strategic. Calendula, borage, and clover appear again and again, planted close to hives. A fringe tidbit whispered among beekeepers claims that certain saints favor bees and will punish villages that neglect them. Lose your hives, lose your harvest, lose your favor. Cause and effect blur into theology very easily when survival is at stake. What surprises you most is how bees intersect with money. Honey is portable, storable, and valuable. It can be taxed, traded, or offered as rent. Wax travels even farther, moving along trade routes to cities where candles fuel cathedrals and guild halls. Bees, in a sense, are medieval economics in miniature. Tiny workers generating surplus value while remaining entirely unaware of market forces. Honestly, goals. You overhear a small dispute near a doorway, someone accusing a neighbor of letting their bees forage too freely. The idea that bees might be stolen, lured, or borrowed without permission sounds absurd to modern ears, but here it's serious business. Bees don't respect property lines, but humans very much do. The law will eventually try to keep up, but for now, social norms do the heavy lifting. You don't mess with another person's bees unless you enjoy long-term grudges and pointed looks at market. As night deepens, you sit on a low bench and let the day settle. You realize that beekeeping isn't a niche craft. It's woven into religion, food, economy, and time itself. Bees mark seasons. They dictate when candles are plentiful, when mead flows, when gardens flourish. They hum beneath everything, unnoticed until they're gone. And that's the real lesson settling over you now. Medieval people don't romanticize bees because they're cute. They respect them because life without them would be shorter, darker, and much less sweet. You wake the next morning with the faint sense that something is already working without you. The village stirs slowly, but the bees are ahead of everyone, humming before the sun fully commits. You drift back toward the garden edges where their homes sit, and now you look at those shapes with new curiosity. Yesterday, they were just straw domes. Today, they're architecture. The skep is the most common hive you see here, woven from straw or reeds and shaped like an upturned basket. It looks almost too simple to matter, but simplicity is the point. One mainstream historical fact becomes clear as you watch a beekeeper gently adjust one. Medieval hives are designed around bee behavior, not human convenience. There are no removable frames, no neat compartments. The hive is a single living space, and once the bees commit to it, the structure stays largely untouched until harvest time. You kneel to get a closer look, careful not to loom. The weave is tight but breathable, insulating the colony against cold while letting moisture escape. The hive sits raised slightly off the ground, protected from damp and opportunistic mice. Nothing here is decorative. Everything is quietly functional. You're struck by how much trial and error must have gone into settling on this form. Generations of small adjustments made without anyone writing them down. Not all hives look like this, though. As you wander farther, you notice hollowed logs standing upright near the edge of a wooded area. These are log hives, closer to how bees live in the wild. Some are suspended from trees to protect them from bears or humans who might help themselves too freely. Others rest against walls, absorbing daytime warmth. The variety surprises you. Medieval beekeeping isn't standardized, it's local, adaptive, and deeply tied to landscape. A quirky tidbit drifts into conversation as someone mentions that bees prefer old homes. There's a belief that a hive that's been lived in before carries good fortune, like a well-seasoned cooking pot. New skeps are sometimes rubbed with herbs or old wax to make them more inviting. Historians still argue whether this practice had a measurable effect on swarm acceptance, or whether it simply made the beekeeper feel useful during a very uncertain process. Either way, the bees usually move in when they're ready, not when asked. You notice that hives are often clustered, but never crowded. There's space between them, as if the bees need personal boundaries too. No one explains this outright, but you sense the logic. Too close, and colonies fight or spread disease. Too far apart, and tending them becomes inefficient. This balance between proximity and respect feels like a recurring theme you keep bumping into. The lack of access to the hive interior stands out to you. Modern beekeeping loves visibility and inspection. Medieval keepers accept mystery. They judge hive health by sound, by traffic at the entrance, by weight when lifted. A strong hive hums with a steady tone. A troubled one sounds thin or agitated. You listen, trying to hear the difference, and immediately feel like you're pretending. The beekeeper smiles in a way that suggests everyone starts there. There's debate, you learn, whether medieval hive designs limited honey yield compared to later methods. Some scholars argue that fixed comb hives encouraged over-harvesting and colony loss, while others point out that keepers often managed this risk by maintaining many small hives instead of relying on a few large ones. It's less efficient by modern standards, but efficiency isn't the only metric here. Resilience matters more. As the sun climbs, you realize how much these humble structures shape the entire practice. The hive determines how bees live, how honey is harvested, and how often humans intervene. It sets the tone for everything that follows. Straw, wood, and space. Nothing fancy, nothing fast. You stand and stretch, brushing dirt from your knees. The bees continue their work, indifferent to your revelations. Their homes may look primitive to you, but they've survived centuries this way. And there's something quietly reassuring about that. You don't always start with a hive. Sometimes you start with a guess and a walk that might lead nowhere. That's the reality settling in as you follow a narrow path out beyond the last gardens, into hedgerows thick with bramble and old oak. This is where bees live when no one has given them a woven home yet, and finding them requires something between patience and mild obsession. The technique you're about to learn is called beelining, though no one here calls it that. It's just watching carefully and not being stupid about it. One mainstream historical fact anchors this practice. Medieval beekeepers regularly captured wild swarms to start new colonies, especially after winter losses. Buying bees isn't really a thing yet. You replenish by finding them, convincing them, or waiting for them to appear when they feel like it. You stand in a small clearing with a shallow wooden dish filled with honey water. The idea is simple enough. A foraging bee finds the food, drinks her fill, then flies home in as straight a line as she can manage. You watch her lift off, orient briefly, then vanish over the hedge. Your job is to note the direction, pace out a distance, and repeat the process closer to wherever you think home might be. It sounds neat and tidy in theory. In practice, it involves a lot of standing around feeling like you're bad at watching insects. There's a quiet thrill when you spot her again returning, precise and unbothered. You mark the angle, adjust your position, and wait. Minutes stretch. You become intensely aware of how loud your own movements are. Twigs snap, grass whispers. The bees, meanwhile, act like GPS satellites with wings. You gain a deep respect very quickly. A quirky belief floats through your thoughts as you work. Some medieval keepers swear bees will deliberately mislead greedy humans. If you take too much honey or approach with the wrong intent, the bees fly crooked, circling uselessly until you give up. Historians still argue whether this belief reflects moral storytelling layered onto failed attempts, or whether bee behavior under stress genuinely appeared erratic enough to inspire the myth. Either way, you find yourself checking your attitude just in case. The forest thickens as you move, and eventually you hear it before you see it, a deeper, more constant hum coming from high up. You tilt your head back and spot a dark hollow in an old oak, bees flickering in and out like sparks. There's a quiet satisfaction in this moment. You followed something small and ordinary to something hidden and essential. Now comes the real test. Finding a wild colony is one thing. Taking it without destroying it is another. Medieval beekeepers debate this endlessly, though not in writing. Do you leave the bees where they are and return later? Do you try to coax them into a new hive? Do you take only honey and risk weakening the colony? There's no universal rule, just judgment shaped by hunger, season, and conscience. You learn that timing matters more than bravery. Swarms, when a colony splits and part of it leaves with a queen, are the real prize. Swarming bees are full of honey, focused on relocation and less defensive. Catching a swarm feels almost like being chosen rather than stealing. People hang empty skeps in trees during swarm season, hoping migrating bees will move in. Sometimes it works, sometimes you get wasps instead, which is objectively the worst outcome. There's debate among historians about how often medieval keepers successfully rehoused wild colonies versus simply harvesting them. Some argue that sustainable capture was rarer than idealized sources suggest, while others point to folk practices designed to encourage gentle relocation. The truth likely sits somewhere in between, shaped by need and local knowledge rather than theory. As you step back from the oak, you feel the weight of choice pressing in. Bees aren't passive resources. They push back, flee, or sting depending on how they're treated. The act of finding them already feels intimate. Taking from them feels consequential. You understand now why so many rules, rituals, and superstitions grow around this moment. They slow people down. They force thought where impulse might otherwise rule. You leave the bees where they are today, not out of virtue exactly, but because learning when not to act feels like part of the craft. The forest hum resumes its background role, and you head back toward human spaces carrying nothing but the knowledge of where life is quietly thriving, without permission. You carry the forest hum back with you, and it settles somewhere behind your ribs, like a reminder to move slower. By now, you're realizing that medieval beekeeping isn't just about managing insects. It's about understanding how people think the world works, and nowhere is that clearer than in how they imagine the minds of bees themselves. You sit near the hives again, watching the constant traffic at the entrance. Bees arrive dusted with pollen, leave with purpose, collide midair, and recover without drama. To modernize, this is instinct and evolution doing their thing. To medieval eyes, this looks suspiciously like reason. One mainstream historical fact anchors this perspective. Medieval writers routinely described bees as rational creatures, capable of order, loyalty, and even moral behavior. They appear in sermons, bestiaries, and moral treatises as models of ideal society. You're not told that bees are like people. You're told instead that people should try harder to be like bees. The hive becomes a living metaphor. Everyone working, no one idle, harmony achieved through shared purpose. There's no room in this vision for freeloaders or rebels, which should already make you a little uneasy. Idealized order tends to come with expectations. You listen as someone explains that bees recognize their keeper. If treated well, they remember you. If mistreated, they hold grudges. This belief is widespread, and while it sounds charming, it also functions as a behavioral guideline. Be gentle, be consistent, don't panic. A quirky tidbit slips in here. Some people claim bees can sense sadness or anger and will respond accordingly. Historians still argue whether such beliefs emerged from genuine observations, like bees reacting to sudden movements, or whether emotional explanations were layered on top of unpredictable stings because humans really hate randomness. The queen, though you don't hear her called that just yet, occupies a strange conceptual space. Medieval thinkers know there is a central ruler in the hive, but they often imagine this figure as male, a king, not a queen. The idea of a female ruler producing the entire colony's future is uncomfortable enough that it takes centuries to fully accept. You sense the mental gymnastics happening in real time. Order must exist. Authority must be singular. Biology, meanwhile, does not care about your social preferences. You're told that bees hate noise. Bells, shouting, sudden clatter, these disturb the hive's inner harmony. Whether this is true or not, the result is clear. People move quietly around bees. They speak softly. They lower their voices. The hive enforces calm simply by existing. You wonder how many human habits were shaped by the presence of creatures believed to be listening. There's an open debate you keep brushing up against without anyone naming it directly. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed bees possessed reason and moral awareness, or whether these descriptions were symbolic tools used to teach human behavior. Sitting here, it feels like both can be true at once. Belief and metaphor blur easily when daily survival depends on cooperation from humans and insects alike. You watch a young boy approach the hives, careful, rehearsed. He's been taught that bees understand intention. His movements are slow, respectful. Whether or not the bees care, the lesson lands. He learns patience, attention, and restraint. The bees become teachers without trying, and that feels important. As the day stretches, you notice how little direct instruction happens. No one lectures, no one diagrams hive structure in the dirt. You learn by watching, listening, absorbing the unspoken assumptions humming beneath every action. Bees are not dumb animals here. They are participants in a shared moral universe, however imaginary that universe might be. You lean back, eyes half closed, letting the steady hum wash over you. The hive doesn't explain itself. It doesn't need to. It simply exists, ordered and alive, and invites humans to either adapt or be stung into humility. And honestly, humility seems like the better option. You drift closer to the stone walls that edge the village, and the air changes almost immediately. It smells cooler here. Damp stone, old leaves, and something faintly herbal. Beyond an arched doorway, you step into a monastery garden, and without anyone announcing it, you understand that this is a different kind of beekeeping space. Quieter, slower, somehow even more deliberate. The monks move with a rhythm that feels rehearsed but not rushed. Prayer structures their day, but so do tasks like tending vegetables, copying manuscripts, and quietly caring for bees. One mainstream historical fact settles in as you watch. Monasteries are among the most important centers of medieval beekeeping. They rely heavily on beeswax candles for long hours of reading and writing, and honey for food, medicine, and brewing. Without bees, the intellectual life of the Middle Ages quite literally dims. You stand near a row of hives tucked against a south-facing wall. The stone absorbs sunlight during the day and releases warmth at night, creating a stable environment. No one explains this to you. They don't have to. The placement itself is the lesson. These men observe first, theologize later. A monk pauses beside you, hands folded into his sleeves, and murmurs something about the bees being creatures of order. It sounds like theology, but it's also just practical description. The hive mirrors the monastery, structured, communal, oriented toward production rather than individual glory. There's a quiet joke here, unspoken but present. Bees don't argue about doctrine or complain about meal schedules. You suspect more than one monk has found that comparison comforting. Honey here goes into remedies as often as it goes into food. Mixed with herbs, it becomes a base for salves and syrups. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you listen. Some monastic recipes insist honey must be harvested in silence to preserve its healing properties. Historians still argue whether this reflects symbolic purity or whether silence simply reduced agitation during harvest. Either way, silence becomes sacred and practical at the same time. Bees also appear in manuscripts copied just a few rooms away. Marginal drawings show hives, flowers, and occasionally bees doing suspiciously human things, wearing crowns, holding tools, even preaching. These images aren't just decorative, they're teaching tools, moral reminders slipped into the margins of serious texts. The bees buzz through theology, agriculture, and art without asking permission. You notice that monks speak to the bees much like villagers do, but with a slightly different tone. Less superstition, more reverence. Or maybe that's just your projection. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here too. Historians still argue whether monastic beekeeping was more scientific than lay practices, or whether it simply preserved and repeated local traditions with better record keeping. Watching them work, it feels less like innovation and more like careful continuity. The bees don't care who tends them. They respond to calm hands and steady rhythms, not vows of poverty. Still, there's something fitting about their presence here. Bees produce sweetness without excess, light without smoke, order without force. If you were designing a creature to appeal to medieval Christian ideals, you'd accidentally invent a bee. As afternoon light slants across the garden, you sit on a low wall and let the hum blend with distant chanting. The monastery doesn't feel separate from the village so much as like a concentrated version of it. The same bees, the same needs, just framed by stone and prayer instead of fences and fields. You realize that beekeeping here isn't about domination or extraction. It's about stewardship, patience, and accepting limits. Ideas that sound lofty until you remember they're keeping real candles burning in real darkness. The bees hum on, unconcerned with theology, quietly powering the medieval mind one drop of honey at a time. You leave the monastery with a faint echo of chanting in your ears, and as the sound fades, another kind of confusion takes its place. It starts as a casual comment from a villager, something about the king of the bees, and it lingers just long enough to itch. You've been watching hives for days now, and something about that title doesn't quite sit right. In the medieval world, hierarchy is expected. Every system must have a ruler, preferably male, preferably singular, preferably decisive. So when people notice that a hive seems organized around one central figure, the conclusion feels obvious. One mainstream historical fact emerges clearly here. Throughout much of the Middle Ages, beekeepers and scholars believe the hive is ruled by a king bee, not a queen. The idea persists stubbornly, reinforced by classical texts and the sheer cultural discomfort with female authority producing order. You listen as someone describes this king as larger, calmer, and wiser than the rest. He does not labor, he governs. The workers, imagined as male as well, serve him loyally. It's a neat story, too neat, and completely wrong in ways that won't be fully unraveled for centuries. What's fascinating is that people aren't blind. They notice that the central bee never leaves the hive. They notice that new bees appear after swarms. They even notice that destroying this central figure dooms the colony. But instead of adjusting the model, they bend observation to fit expectation. A king who doesn't fight, doesn't forage, and somehow creates life without being female is odd, but less odd, apparently, than a queen doing all of that. There's a quirky workaround some medieval thinkers adopt. They suggest the king bee is sexless or a perfect being beyond gender. Historians still argue whether this was an early attempt at biological nuance or simply philosophical gymnastics to avoid acknowledging a female reproductive authority. Watching the hive, you suspect it's the latter. The bees, meanwhile, continue not caring about your social theories. You're also told that worker bees are male soldiers, disciplined and obedient. The idea that most of the hive consists of sterile females doing all the work simply doesn't land yet. It clashes too sharply with social norms. This misunderstanding shapes how people talk about labor, loyalty, and duty. Bees become moral symbols first, biological organisms second. Despite the flawed theory, some observations are surprisingly accurate. People know the hive collapses without its ruler. They know swarming involves reproduction. They know timing matters. They just mislabel the roles. It's like having a perfectly functional map with all the place names swapped. There's an open debate woven quietly through later scholarship. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeepers' practical success occurred despite these misunderstandings or because they didn't interfere too much. By assuming the hive's inner workings were sacred or mysterious, keepers avoided constant meddling. Wrong theory, right outcome. It's a pattern you're starting to recognize. You find yourself oddly fond of this confusion. It reveals something human and familiar. When facts threaten identity, identity usually wins. The bees don't challenge medieval gender norms loudly enough to force a rethink, so the story adapts instead. The hive becomes a mirror, reflecting not what it is, but what people expect society to be. As evening settles out again, you watch the hive entrance quiet down. The ruler, queen, king, or divine mystery remains unseen. Life continues regardless of the name you give it, and that feels like a gentle reminder that understanding often lags behind practice. The bees keep living their truth. Humans keep telling stories around it. Somewhere between the two, medieval beekeeping hums along, effective without being fully understood. You notice honey differently now, not just as sweetness, but as substance. Thick, slow, golden, almost stubborn in how it refuses to hurry. When someone hands you a small wooden spoon dipped into a jar, the scent alone feels medicinal. And in the medieval world, that's not metaphor. Honey is medicine, and not in a vague grandma says it helps way. It's a cornerstone of treatment. One mainstream historical fact settles in quickly. Medieval medical texts regularly prescribe honey for wounds, sore throats, digestive trouble, and infections. Its antibacterial properties aren't named as such, but they're observed. Honey keeps wounds from festering. It preserves herbs. It soothes inflammation. Doctors, such as they are, trust it because it works often enough to matter. You watch as honey is mixed with vinegar to create oxymel, a sharp sweet syrup used for everything from coughs to fevers. Another mixture blends honey with ground herbs into thick pastes spread on cloth and pressed against skin. The process is careful, almost reverent. This isn't folk magic operating in opposition to medicine. This is medicine, built from experience rather than theory. Of course, the line between medicine and myth is thin here. A quirky tidbit slips into conversation. Some healers insist honey collected under a full moon is more potent. Others swear spring honey heals differently than autumn honey. Historians still argue whether seasonal variations in honey composition could have produced subtle effects, or whether these claims simply layered cosmic meaning onto a substance already trusted. Either way, timing becomes part of treatment, not just harvesting. Honey also enters cosmetics, which feels oddly modern until you remember people have always wanted their skin to behave. Mixed with milk or oils, honey becomes a cleanser and moisturizer. There's a belief that it preserves youth, or at least delays decay, which feels optimistic but understandable when your alternative options are mostly animal fat and ash. You notice how gently people apply it, how sparingly. This isn't abundance, this is careful use of something valuable. In religious contexts, honey takes on symbolic weight. It represents purity, divine favor, and the sweetness of sacred knowledge. Sermons compare scripture to honey, nourishing, desirable, but requiring effort to gather. You begin to see how bees bridge the physical and spiritual worlds without ever being asked to. There's debate threaded quietly through modern scholarship. Historians still argue whether medieval reliance on honey delayed the adoption of other medical practices, or whether it provided a stable, effective baseline that carried healing knowledge forward. Sitting here watching honey do its slow work, it feels less like a delay and more like a foundation. You taste it again, just a drop, and it coats your tongue, lingering. Honey doesn't rush to impress, it stays. And in a world where so much is uncertain, harvests, health, survival, that reliability matters. Bees give people something they can count on, even when theory fails and explanations wobble. As the jar is sealed and set away, you realize honey isn't just a product of beekeeping. It's a quiet promise that nature, when treated gently, will give back in ways that feel almost kind. As night settles in again, you begin to notice what happens when honey steps aside and wax takes center stage. The village changes character after sunset, and the difference is measured in flame. You follow the glow into homes, workshops, and the chapel, and it becomes clear very quickly that not all light is created equal. One mainstream historical fact anchors itself here. Beeswax candles are among the most valued products of medieval beekeeping, especially for religious use. Unlike tallow candles made from animal fat, beeswax burns cleaner, brighter, and with far less smoke. It smells faintly sweet instead of aggressively meaty, which is a huge upgrade when you're indoors for hours. Churches, monasteries, and anyone who can afford it prefer beeswax, not for luxury, but for clarity, both literal and spiritual. You step inside the chapel again and watch the flame hold steady, barely flickering. This kind of light allows reading, copying, and contemplation after dark. It extends human thought into the night without choking it. Without beeswax, entire chunks of medieval intellectual life would simply stop when the sun went down. That's not poetic exaggeration, it's logistics. Wax is treated with reverence here. It's collected carefully, cleaned, melted, strained, and molded with patience. Nothing feels rushed. A quirky belief floats through the room as someone mentions that beeswax candles carry the purity of the hive and therefore burn more pleasingly to God. Historians still argue whether this belief developed because beeswax was already reserved for sacred spaces, or whether the symbolic meaning elevated its status over time. Either way, the association sticks hard. You notice that broken candles are never wasted. Stubs are saved, remelted, reshaped. Wax circulates almost endlessly, changing form, but never truly disappearing. In a world where resources are limited and labor is heavy, that kind of reusability feels quietly miraculous. Bees produce light that can be recycled. Outside religious spaces, beeswax still matters. It seals containers, waterproofs thread, lubricates tools, and finishes wood. You watch someone rub wax into a leather strap, restoring flexibility. Another presses it into the seams of a wooden box. The hive extends its influence into craftsmanship, preservation, and daily problem solving. Bees don't just make sweetness, they make things last. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here as well. Historians still argue whether the demand for beeswax drove the expansion of beekeeping more than honey itself, especially in ecclesiastical contexts. Watching the candlelight spread across stone walls, it's easy to believe wax might have been the true engine all along. Sweetness feeds the body, light feeds everything else. As you sit in the half-dark, you realize how gentle this technology is. No roaring fire, no sparks, no constant tending. Just a steady flame born from flowers, carried by bees, shaped by human hands. It's collaboration across species and time. The candle burns lower, and no one rushes to replace it. Darkness isn't feared here, just negotiated. You lean back, letting the warm glow soften the edges of the room, and you understand that beekeeping doesn't just support medieval life, it illuminates it, one quiet flame at a time. You begin to feel the year turning, not by calendars, but by bee behavior. The rhythm settles into you slowly, like learning a song by hearing it often enough. Medieval beekeeping is seasonal, not just in practice, but in mindset. Each phase asks something different of you: attention, restraint, patience, or acceptance. Spring arrives first in the sound. The hive grows louder, busier, almost restless. Bees surge out into new blossoms, and you sense the urgency in their movement. One mainstream historical fact becomes clear early in the season. Spring is when medieval beekeepers focus on swarm prevention and expansion. Colonies that survived winter are strong now, and strength brings the risk of division. Swarming is natural, but unmanaged, it means losing half your workforce to the woods. You watch as keepers add space, not inside the hive because that's not how skeps work, but around it. New skeps are placed nearby, baited with old wax or herbs, ready to receive wandering bees. This is a season of preparation rather than interference. People don't open hives to check progress. They watch entrances, listen to tone, and trust experience. Spring rewards those who don't panic. Summer feels almost easy by comparison. Flowers are abundant, days are long, and bees settle into steady work. You notice fewer interventions now. One fringe belief floats around that too much attention in summer annoys bees and invites trouble. Historians still argue whether reduced handling was a conscious strategy to avoid stings during peak activity or simply a byproduct of everyone being too busy with harvests elsewhere. Either way, the bees are largely left alone, and they seem fine with that. Autumn brings weight, literally. Beekeepers lift hives slightly, judging their heft. A heavy hive promises winter survival. A light one brings hard decisions. This is when honey is harvested, carefully and selectively. You sense the tension here. Take too much and the bees starve. Take too little and people do. There's no perfect answer, only local wisdom, shaped by past winters. Winter is the quiet season, and it demands restraint. One mainstream historical fact anchors this period. Beekeepers rarely disturb hives during winter, believing that warmth and stillness are essential. Bees cluster inside, living off stored honey, vibrating just enough to keep from freezing. You're told that opening a hive now is worse than useless. It's dangerous. Cold air kills faster than hunger. A quirky belief surfaces as someone mentions that bees dream in winter, storing up energy and intention for spring. Historians still argue whether this reflects genuine observation of clustered inactivity or a poetic attempt to humanize a necessary mystery. Sitting in the cold, it feels kinder to imagine the bees resting rather than merely enduring. You walk past snow-dusted skeps and feel the weight of the year behind you. Beekeeping isn't a constant activity here, it's a series of attentions timed to the needs of another species. You don't bend bees to your schedule, you bend yourself to theirs. By now, you've stopped thinking of time as something you measure. It's something you listen to. The hive tells you when to act and when to wait, and learning that difference might be the most valuable skill of all. You know what's coming before anyone says it out loud. Autumn's weight leads here, always. The hive is heavy. The air smells faintly of ripe fruit and damp leaves, and everyone moves with a careful seriousness that feels almost ceremonial. This is the moment medieval beekeeping never quite softens: the harvest. No one rushes toward the hives. That would feel wrong, even dangerous. Instead, you wait until the day is warm enough for bees to fly, but calm enough that tempers, human and insect, stay level. One mainstream historical fact grounds the moment. In much of medieval Europe, honey harvesting from skeps often involves killing or severely weakening the colony, because fixed comb hives can't be opened without destruction. This is the part modern beekeepers quietly wince at. You feel the contradiction immediately. So much care, so much gentleness all year, and now this. The gentle science doesn't pretend otherwise. It simply asks that violence be minimized, timed, and acknowledged. Smoke plays its role again, thicker this time, drifting into the hive to calm the bees and push them deeper inward. The smell is heavier now, sweet and acrid together. You notice how few words are spoken. There's no joking here. Even the people who laugh easily fall quiet. A quirky belief hangs in the air. Bees must not hear anger or gloating during harvest, or the sweetness will turn. Historians still argue whether this silence was symbolic respect or a practical way to reduce agitation and stings. Either way, restraint rules the moment. The hive is lifted, inverted, and opened. Honeycomb glows inside, golden, sticky, alive with stored sunlight. You feel awe first, then guilt. That combination seems appropriate. Not all comb is taken. Experienced keepers leave sections intact when possible, especially if winter stores look marginal. It's not mercy exactly, but it's not cruelty either. It's negotiation under pressure. There's debate, both then and now, about how common full colony destruction truly was. Historians still argue whether medieval sources exaggerate losses or whether sustainable practices were more widespread than assumed. Watching this careful extraction, you suspect reality varies by place and year. Hunger changes ethics. Abundance softens them. The honey is pressed slowly, allowed to drain by gravity rather than force. Wax is separated and saved. Nothing is wasted. The bees that survive drift back, confused but persistent. Life resumes in altered form. You're struck by how the act doesn't feel triumphant. There's no celebration, only relief and quiet gratitude. Later, as jars are sealed and combs scraped clean, you sense the emotional weight lifting slightly. The work is done. The village will be fed. Candles will burn. Remedies will be mixed. The cost is understood. No one pretends otherwise. You sit back, sticky-handed and thoughtful. The gentle science doesn't promise innocence. It promises awareness. And in a world balanced on thin margins, that may be the best anyone can offer. After the heaviness of harvest, everything slows again. Not abruptly, but like a long exhale you didn't realize you were holding. The hives that remain are fewer now, quieter, and the way people approach them changes. You notice it immediately. Hands move slower, footsteps soften. This is the phase where technique matters less than temperament. Smoke returns to its gentlest form. Not the thick harvest time clouds, but thin wandering ribbons meant to announce presence rather than enforce calm. One mainstream historical fact anchors this practice. Medieval beekeepers widely used smoke, herbs, and controlled movement as their primary tools for managing bees, relying on behavior rather than barriers. There are no suits to hide behind. Everything you do is felt, seen, or smelled by the hive. You watch someone prepare the smoker. Not metal, just a clay pot and smoldering plant matter. Dried straw is common, but herbs are added deliberately. Lavender, thyme, sage. The scent is softer, almost pleasant. A quirky belief floats up as the smoke curls. Certain herbs are said to please bees, making them more cooperative. Historians still argue whether this had any measurable effect beyond masking alarm pheromones, but the ritual persists because it encourages gentleness, and gentleness works often enough to be trusted. The real lesson, though, isn't in the smoke, it's in the hands. You see how beekeepers move slowly, never directly in front of the hive entrance, never casting sudden shadows. Movements are rounded, predictable, almost dance-like. Bees respond not to commands, but to absence of threat. You realize this entire craft has trained people to become less startling versions of themselves. There's talk, quiet, half-joking about angry days, when bees simply refuse cooperation no matter what you do. Weather, humidity, unseen disturbances. On those days, wise keepers walk away. One fringe tidbit claims bees remember bad encounters and will punish repeat offenders. Historians still argue whether this reflects genuine pattern recognition in bees or whether humans projected memory onto coincidence. Either way, the advice stands: don't force it. You notice how often people choose not to act. A hive hums oddly? Wait a day. Bees cluster strangely? Observe first. Intervention is always the last step, not the first. This restraint feels almost radical to you, accustomed as you are to constant checking and fixing. Here, patience is the primary technology. Children are taught early to respect this rhythm. You watch one approach a hive, stop, reconsider, and step back without being told. That moment, choosing not to touch, is quietly praised. The bees teach boundaries without words, and the lesson sticks. There's an ongoing debate that lingers in the background. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeeping succeeded because of accumulated practical knowledge or because limited tools prevented overmanagement. Sitting here, you suspect it's both. When you can't open a hive on a whim, you learn to listen instead. As dusk approaches, the hives settle into evening quiet. Smoke drifts away. Hands fall to sides. Nothing dramatic happens, and that's the point. Success here is measured in calm endings, not dramatic interventions. You realize that the gentlest part of this science isn't what it does to bees, it's what it does to people. It trains you to slow down, to notice, to accept that not every problem is yours to solve immediately. And that lesson hums on long after the bees have gone quiet. You start noticing who isn't being loudly credited. It's not dramatic, no revelation, no announcement, but once you see it, it's hard to unsee. The quiet continuity of beekeeping knowledge often passes through hands that history barely bothers to name. Women move around the hives with familiarity that suggests inheritance, not instruction. One mainstream historical fact settles in gently. Women, especially widows and unmarried women, are frequently responsible for beekeeping in medieval households. Bees fit into domestic rhythms, gardens, food preservation, medicine making, and those spaces are often managed by women. When land passes hands after a death, hives often come with it. Bees are movable wealth, and women know how to keep them alive. You watch an older woman approach a skep with the confidence of someone who's done this longer than anyone remembers. She doesn't explain what she's doing. She doesn't need to. Her movements are precise, practiced, and calm. The bees respond accordingly. This isn't magic, it's repetition stretched across decades. There's a quiet stereotype floating around that women are naturally better with bees because they're calmer, gentler, more patient. It sounds flattering until you realize it's doing a lot of social work, praising the result while ignoring the labor. A quirky tidbit surfaces as someone mentions that bees prefer women keepers. Historians still argue whether this belief emerged from observed behavior or from gendered assumptions layered onto success. Either way, the belief sticks because it explains competence without challenging hierarchy. Much of bee lore, songs, sayings, timing rules passes orally, not through texts. You realize how easily that knowledge disappears from written history. Recipes for honey remedies are copied into manuscripts, but the everyday rules for keeping bees alive often live only in memory. When those memories belong to women without titles, they fade fast. You overhear a widow explaining when not to harvest, when to leave a hive alone even if times are hard. Her authority isn't formal, but it's respected. People listen because her bees survive winters others don't. Skill earns trust, even when it doesn't earn records. There's an open scholarly debate humming under the surface. Historians still argue how much medieval agricultural knowledge was shaped and preserved by women versus attributed to male landowners or clergy in surviving sources. Sitting here, watching this quiet competence, it feels obvious that the written record is incomplete. Bees don't care whose name gets remembered. You notice how bee lore overlaps with domestic ritual. Hives are informed of deaths, marriages, departures. Someone murmurs that bees must be told everything important or they'll leave. This practice, often carried out by women, blends care, superstition, and emotional continuity. Whether or not bees understand, people do. The act creates closure. As evening comes on, you realize that beekeeping knowledge isn't flashy. It doesn't announce itself. It hums beneath daily life, passed hand to hand, generation to generation. And much of it survives because someone quietly kept doing it, long after history stopped paying attention. You sit with that thought, listening to the bees, and let the uncredited expertise settle where it belongs, at the center, not the margins. You think bees would be above human arguments. You really do. Tiny, winged, focused on flowers and light. Surely they'd be spared our paperwork and pettiness. And yet, as you linger long enough in this world, you discover that bees buzz straight into the realm of law, fines, and very serious disagreements. It starts with a raised voice near the market. Not shouting exactly, but the tight, controlled tone of someone who feels wronged and wants witnesses. One mainstream historical fact becomes unavoidable here. Medieval legal codes across Europe include specific rules about bees, swarms, and honey ownership. Bees might fly freely, but humans are deeply invested in deciding who gets to claim them. The problem, of course, is movement. Bees don't stay put. A swarm might rise from one hive and settle in a neighbor's tree, or drift into a hollow log on common land. Whose bees are they now? The original keepers? The landowners? Whoever catches them first? Different regions answer differently, and arguments follow accordingly. You listen as someone explains the rule of pursuit. In many places, if you follow your swarm, visibly, continuously, you retain your claim. Lose sight of it, and ownership dissolves. It sounds reasonable until you imagine sprinting through hedges while staring at a cloud of insects, trying not to blink. Medieval cardio, but make it legally binding. There's a quirky workaround, too. Some laws allow keepers to mark swarms by throwing dust, ash, or even ringing bells while in pursuit, symbolically maintaining connection. Historians still argue whether such practices were ever enforceable or whether they simply formalized social expectations into something that felt fair. Either way, the rules exist because bees matter enough to fight over. Fines for stealing honey are steep. Tampering with hives is treated more seriously than garden theft, reflecting the long-term value of a colony. Bees aren't a one-time resource, they're ongoing income. Hurt them, and you've damaged future seasons, not just today's supply. You notice how these laws try, and mostly fail, to tame unpredictability. Bees ignore borders, fences, and legal language. Human systems bend around that reality, adapting with surprising creativity. The law here feels less like rigid control and more like negotiated coexistence. There's an open debate woven through later scholarship. Historians still argue whether medieval bee laws reflect genuine attempts at sustainable management or whether they primarily protected elite landowners with the means to pursue and defend claims. Standing among villagers arguing quietly but intently, you suspect it's both. Law rarely belongs entirely to one side. Eventually, voices lower. Compromises are suggested. Honey is shared. No one seems thrilled, but no one storms off either. The bees, meanwhile, continue flying, blissfully unaware that their movements have inspired a legal framework. You walk away smiling faintly. Even here, among rules, fines, and grudges, the gentle science persists. Bees force humans to adapt, not the other way around. And somehow, against all odds, it mostly works. You start paying attention to the sky the way people here do. Not casually, not as background, but as a source of instruction. Clouds aren't just weather, they're information. And the bees, it turns out, are some of the best forecasters anyone has. Morning breaks heavy and still, the kind of air that presses against your skin. The hives sound different today, lower, almost tense. One mainstream historical fact emerges as you listen to the commentary around you. Medieval beekeepers closely observe bee behavior to predict weather, timing work and harvests around hive activity. Long before barometers, bees are treated as living instruments. If bees stay close to the hive, rain is coming. If they fly high and wide, fair weather will hold. This knowledge isn't written down so much as repeated until it becomes instinct. You catch yourself checking the hive entrance before looking at the sky, and you realize you're learning the habit without meaning to. Saints' days matter too. Certain feast days are believed to align with shifts in bee behavior, swarming, aggression, or quiet. A quirky belief surfaces that bees honor specific saints by working harder or resting more. Historians still argue whether these associations arose from coincidental seasonal patterns or whether they reflect an attempt to Christianize older agricultural calendars. Either way, the result is a hybrid system where religion, weather, and insects all speak at once. You notice how storms change everything. Bees grow irritable before thunder, and experienced keepers don't approach hives when the air feels electric. It's not fear exactly, more like respect for heightened sensitivity. There's debate here too. Historians still argue whether medieval keepers correctly interpreted pre-storm agitation or whether they simply avoided bad conditions out of hard-earned caution. Watching a hive settle just as clouds break, it's hard not to believe the bees knew first. Omens drift in around the edges. A hive that goes silent suddenly is said to warn of death. Bees abandoning a home are thought to signal misfortune. These interpretations feel heavy, but they also reflect how tightly bees are woven into emotional life. When your survival aligns with theirs, their behavior feels personal. You walk through fields as rain finally begins, soft and steady. Bees retreat, flowers close, and work pauses. No one fights it. The weather sets the pace, and the bees confirm it. Control, you're learning, is mostly an illusion. As evening comes, the storm passes, and the bees return to flight as if nothing happened. The day resets. You breathe easier. The lesson lands gently. Listen first, act second. You'd like to believe the hive's biggest problems are weather and human error. It would be comforting if that were true, but once you start paying attention, you realize the bees are surrounded by enemies, some obvious, some small, some depressingly clever. Survival here is not just about flowers and patience, it's about defense. The most dramatic threat is talked about in lowered voices, usually with a glance toward the woods. One mainstream historical fact anchors this fear. In parts of medieval Europe, bears are a genuine danger to beehives. Honey is calorie-dense, easy to smell, and absolutely irresistible if you're large, hungry, and covered in fur. Bears tear apart skeps without hesitation, leaving straw, comb, and dignity scattered everywhere. The solutions are creative. Hives are raised on tall poles, hung from trees, or placed near human dwellings where noise and fire offer deterrence. None of this is foolproof. Bears are strong, curious, and not particularly concerned with your clever joinery. Still, people try. The effort itself feels like a negotiation with nature. Please don't notice this. Smaller enemies are often worse. Mice slip into hives during winter, drawn by warmth and honey. Wax moths lay eggs that hatch into larvae capable of destroying comb from the inside out. Ants swarm in relentless lines. One quirky tidbit you hear involves smearing hive stands with grease or ash to block ants, a low-tech solution that works just well enough to survive centuries. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeeping losses were primarily environmental or human-driven, and how much defensive innovation actually reduced them. Watching people adapt hive placement year after year, it feels less like solving a problem and more like managing ongoing risk. You realize something quietly important. Beekeeping here isn't passive, it's attentive. Bees are protected not by walls or weapons, but by observation, placement, and persistence. Defense blends into care. The line between enemy and environment blurs. As night falls, you hear nothing unusual. No snapping branches, no frantic buzzing, just the steady hum of life holding for now. You exhale. Survival, you're learning, often looks like an uneventful evening. You think you've learned most of the practical rules by now. Where to stand, when to wait, how not to annoy an entire colony at once. But then you notice something stranger. People talk to the bees. Not jokingly, not as a performance, quietly, deliberately, as if the hive is another member of the household who deserves to be kept informed. It happens without ceremony. A woman pauses by the hives and murmurs a few words before leaving for the market. A man leans in and speaks softly after returning from a funeral. One mainstream historical fact becomes clear as you observe this pattern. In medieval Europe, many communities believe bees must be told of important life events, deaths, marriages, departures, or they may leave the hive or stop producing honey. This practice, sometimes called telling the bees, doesn't feel theatrical. It feels intimate. The voice drops, the body leans closer, and the words come out measured and calm. You can't always hear what's said, but the tone is unmistakable. This isn't instruction, it's inclusion. A quirky explanation circulates for why this matters. Bees, people say, are sensitive to disruption. They notice absence. If a keeper dies and no one explains why he stopped coming, the bees grieve in their own way by abandoning the hive. Historians still argue whether such abandonment was a real observable phenomenon linked to changes in care, or whether grief narratives helped people process loss through ritual. Standing here, it feels less important which is true. You're struck by how this belief changes behavior. It encourages continuity. Someone must take responsibility for the bees, must speak to them, must maintain the relationship. Silence becomes a form of neglect. Words, even if symbolic, become care. Songs appear too, soft and repetitive. Not performances, just habits, little melodies hummed while tending hives. Some claim the rhythm calms bees. Others say it simply keeps the keeper calm. Historians still argue which direction the benefit flows, but the effect is visible either way. Hands steady, breathing slows, mistakes decrease. There's a gentle joke tucked into the practice as well. Someone quips that bees are better listeners than people because they never interrupt. The humor is light, but it lands. In a world where being heard isn't guaranteed, speaking to creatures that hum back feels oddly reassuring. You try it yourself, quietly, experimentally. You tell the bees nothing important, just that the day is ending, that you'll be back. It feels silly for about half a second, and then it doesn't. The act of speaking marks attention. It draws a boundary around the moment. Whether the bees understand is almost beside the point. There's an ongoing debate humming under modern scholarship. Historians still argue whether telling the bees reflects animistic beliefs, Christian ritual, or practical memory aids embedded in folklore. Watching how naturally it fits into daily life, you suspect it's all three layered together. As dusk settles, the hives quiet down. Words fade. The day closes not with orders or measurements, but with acknowledgement. You step back, feeling oddly included yourself. And maybe that's the real function of the ritual. Not to inform the bees, but to remind humans that they're not alone in the work of living. You follow the honey now, not back to the hives, but outward, into movement and exchange. It leaves the quiet edges of gardens and enters louder spaces, markets, storehouses, counting tables where fingers grow sticky just handling the containers. Bees don't know it, but this is where their work becomes visible power. One mainstream historical fact settles in as you watch the bustle. Honey is a significant trade good in medieval Europe, moving locally and regionally as both food and resource. In places without access to imported sugar, honey fills that gap entirely. It sweetens bread, preserves fruit, flavors drink and carries medicinal value, making it versatile enough to justify transport over long distances. You stand near a stall where small ceramic jars are arranged carefully, each sealed with wax. Buyers sniff, taste, argue quietly over quality. Color matters, thickness matters, floral source matters, even if no one uses those exact words. Forest honey, meadow honey, late season honey, people can tell the difference, and they're willing to pay for it. Wax travels even farther. Candle makers, churches, and monasteries create steady demand, and that demand turns bees into economic assets. Hives are counted alongside livestock in estate records. Rents are paid in honey. Taxes are assessed in wax. You realize this gentle craft hums beneath the medieval economy like a second, quieter currency. There's a quirky workaround for transport problems that makes you smile. Some traders prefer to move honey still in the comb, sealed and protected by wax, rather than strained. It's heavier, messier, but less likely to ferment or spill. Historians still argue whether this practice was more about preservation or about demonstrating authenticity, proof that nothing had been diluted or tampered with. Either way, presentation becomes part of trust. You overhear negotiations that feel surprisingly modern. Someone complains about adulterated honey, watered down, overheated, or mixed with inferior product. Even here, quality control matters. Reputation sticks. A beekeeper known for clean, fragrant honey sells easily. One known for shortcuts struggles. Bees might be quiet, but markets remember. There's tension, too. In years of poor harvest, honey prices rise sharply. Those without access feel it first. Sweetness becomes a marker of inequality. Historians still argue whether honey trade concentrated wealth or simply reflected existing social divides. Watching jars change hands, you sense both dynamics at play. Bees don't choose who benefits most from their labor. As evening draws on, the market thins. Honey moves into storage, into kitchens, into churches. Wax heads toward candle molds. The buzz fades, replaced by quieter accounting and careful sealing. You walk away understanding something new. Beekeeping doesn't just sustain life, it connects it. From flower to hive to hand to home, the bees bind people together through exchange. And all of it, every coin, every candle, begins with a hum you almost didn't notice. By now, the bees feel familiar, practical, useful, grounded in dirt and weather. But then the tone shifts again, almost without warning. You notice it first in language. Words like purity, transformation, soul. The bees begin to drift upward, not physically, but symbolically, lifting out of gardens and markets and into places where meaning thickens. You're sitting near someone who speaks of honey not as food, but as proof. Proof that decay can become nourishment. Proof that effort can turn chaos into order. One mainstream historical fact anchors this shift. Medieval scholars, theologians, and alchemists frequently use bees and honey as symbols of spiritual transformation, purity, and divine order. Bees appear in sermons, mystical writings, and early alchemical texts with surprising frequency. Alchemy, especially, loves bees. Honey ferments, wax melts and reforms. Substances change state without losing essence. To a medieval mind searching for meaning in material change, this feels significant. Bees seem to operate at the boundary between the earthly and the divine. Creatures that touch flowers and produce something incorruptible, or at least something that lasts far longer than it should. A quirky belief surfaces in hushed tones. Some alchemists claim bees know secrets of transformation humans can only imitate badly. Historians still argue whether this reflects genuine experimental curiosity, watching fermentation, preservation, and combustion, or whether bees simply became convenient metaphors for processes people couldn't yet explain. Sitting here, you get the sense that explanation wasn't always the goal. Sometimes resonance was enough. Bees also show up in ideas about the soul, their apparent selflessness, their devotion to the hive, their willingness to die defending it. All of this feeds moral interpretation. Bees become symbols of ideal devotion, both to God and to community. You notice how often the word sweetness appears in spiritual texts, standing in for grace, wisdom, or divine reward. Honey becomes theology you can taste. There's tension here, too. Not everyone is comfortable with how much meaning gets piled onto an insect. Some writers warn against reading too much into nature, reminding readers that bees are still animals, not angels. Historians still argue whether these cautionary voices represent early scientific skepticism or simply theological boundary setting. Either way, the debate hums quietly beneath the symbolism. You find yourself thinking back to the hive itself, how little it seems to care about interpretation. Bees transform nectar because they must, not because it's meaningful. And yet, meaning accumulates anyway, layered on by human need. The hive becomes a mirror again, reflecting hopes, fears, and aspirations. As night deepens, candlelight flickers and wax softens near flame. Transformation is happening everywhere you look. Nothing here feels abstract. Alchemy isn't hidden in laboratories. It's on the table, in the air, in the quiet work of insects doing what they've always done. You sit with that thought, letting it settle. Bees don't seek enlightenment. They produce it accidentally, and humans rush in to name it. Maybe that's how most meaning works. You begin to travel without really going anywhere. The bees stay the same, but the world around them shifts, and you feel it in the soil underfoot, the trees at the margins, the way hives are placed as if responding to accents in the land. Medieval beekeeping, you're learning, is not a single tradition. It's a collection of local conversations with the same species. In forested regions, hives lean into shade and height. You see them tucked against tree lines, hung from branches, or carved directly into trunks. One mainstream historical fact becomes clear as you move through these spaces. Medieval beekeeping practices vary widely by region, shaped by climate, vegetation, and available materials. There is no universal, correct method, only what works here. In open farmland, the hives cluster closer to gardens and hedgerows. Straw skeps dominate where grain is plentiful. Wooden hives appear where timber is abundant. In mountainous areas, hives are fewer but fiercely protected, positioned where flowers bloom briefly and intensely. Bees adapt. Humans adapt with them. A quirky regional belief catches your attention as you listen to travelers talk. In some areas, bees are said to prefer certain dialects, responding better to familiar voices. Historians still argue whether this reflects anything beyond the comfort of routine, but the belief encourages consistency. The same people tend the same hives year after year, reinforcing local knowledge without ever formalizing it. You notice differences in honey, too. Darker in forests, lighter in meadows. Some honeys crystallize quickly, others stay fluid longer. These variations aren't just curiosities, they influence how honey is used. Thick forest honey goes into medicine. Lighter meadow honey sweetens food. Bees become regional signatures, tasting faintly of place. There's debate threaded through modern scholarship about whether medieval beekeeping knowledge spread efficiently between regions or remained stubbornly local. Historians still argue how much innovation traveled versus how much was reinvented independently. Watching similar solutions appear in distant landscapes, you suspect humans and bees meet the same problems and often arrive at the same answers without ever speaking. As evening settles wherever you happen to be, the hives quiet in familiar ways. Different landscapes, same hum. You realize adaptability, rather than control, is the real inheritance medieval beekeeping passes down. You stop walking, finally, and let the sense of place dissolve. Bees don't care where you are. They care where the flowers are. And humans, at their best, learn to follow. You don't learn the craft only from what survives. You learn it from what doesn't. By now, you've heard enough quiet stories to know that medieval beekeeping is littered with well-meant disasters, remembered not as triumphs, but as warnings passed along with a shake of the head. One mainstream historical fact settles in here with a dull thud. Entire bee colonies regularly fail in the medieval period, often due to human misjudgment rather than disease alone. Winter starvation, poorly timed harvests, bad placement. Mistakes compound quickly when you're working with living systems you can't fully inspect. You hear about someone who harvested too late, trusting that autumn warmth would last. The cold came early, the bees clustered, honey stores ran thin, and the hive went silent by midwinter. No villain, no drama, just a lesson etched into memory. Timing, you realize, is unforgiving. Another common failure comes from overconfidence. A keeper notices a strong hive and assumes it can spare more honey than usual. It looks fine, it sounds fine, and then spring arrives without bees. A quirky belief attaches itself to these stories. Bees abandon hives owned by the greedy. Historians still argue whether this belief moralized natural loss or genuinely discouraged overharvesting through fear of shame. Either way, the story sticks because it hurts just enough to remember. Superstition causes its own share of damage. Someone insists on opening a hive during winter to check on them. Someone else moves hives repeatedly to ward off imagined bad luck. These actions feel caring in the moment, but the result is often the same: stress, cold, collapse. There's an ongoing debate here, too. Historians still argue whether medieval losses stemmed more from ignorance or from excessive intervention driven by anxiety. Watching people recount these failures, you suspect anxiety wins often. Disease exists, of course, but it's poorly understood. When hives fail mysteriously, explanations turn symbolic. Bad air, evil influence, broken ritual. These stories don't cure anything, but they do shape behavior, sometimes for the better. If fear keeps hands away during fragile seasons, it accidentally helps. You realize something important. Mistakes are shared more freely than successes. People talk about what went wrong so others won't repeat it. Knowledge here is defensive, built around avoiding disaster rather than chasing maximum yield. Survival beats optimization every time. As dusk settles, you think about how fragile the balance really is. Bees forgive a lot, but not everything. Medieval beekeeping survives not because people master bees, but because they learn, slowly and painfully, where the edges are. And once you've lost a hive, you never forget how quiet failure sounds. You notice the bees again in places you weren't expecting to see them at all, not humming in gardens or hovering over flowers, but frozen in ink, carved into stone, tucked into corners where the eye only wanders when it's bored or tired. The bees have followed you into art, and they're clearly enjoying the anonymity. One mainstream historical fact anchors this discovery. Bees appear frequently in medieval art, especially in manuscript marginalia, carvings and decorative motifs, where they function as symbols of labor, order, and sweetness. They rarely take center stage. Instead, they hover at the edges, doing what they always do, working quietly while something else gets the credit. You lean over a manuscript page, watching a monk turn it carefully. In the margin, a tiny bee buzzes toward a flower that looks suspiciously like it's smirking. Elsewhere, bees wear crowns, chase bears, or participate in absurd little scenes that feel almost like inside jokes. These images aren't random, Marginalia is where medieval artists allow themselves a little freedom, and bees become safe carriers of humor and commentary. A quirky tidbit surfaces as someone points out that bees in manuscripts sometimes appear alongside snails, foxes, and rabbits, animals commonly used for satire. Historians still argue whether bees in these contexts are meant to reinforce moral lessons or gently poke fun at human seriousness. Sitting with the page, you suspect it's both. Humor and instruction blend easily when you don't over-explain. Stone carvings tell a quieter story. Bees appear on church capitals and household objects, stylized into repeating patterns. Here, they're less playful and more symbolic. Endless labor, endless return. You trace a carved wing with your eyes and realize how familiar the shape feels. Even abstracted, the bee is recognizable. It carries its meaning efficiently. There's an open debate that hums beneath these images. Historians still argue whether medieval artists observed bees closely or relied on inherited visual conventions. Some bees look anatomically strange, too many legs, impossible wings, while others feel surprisingly accurate. Watching them side by side, you get the sense that accuracy mattered less than resonance. The bee needed to read as a bee, not convince a biologist. You smile at a tiny detail you almost missed. A monk in the margin chasing a bee with exaggerated frustration. It feels modern, relatable, and deeply human. Even in art meant to preserve sacred texts, there's room for irritation and laughter. Bees irritate people just enough to be funny, not enough to be hated. As you step back, you realize these images do something subtle. They normalize the presence of bees in thought and imagination. Bees aren't exotic. They're familiar companions in work, prayer, and boredom. They belong everywhere, even in jokes. You leave the manuscript behind and carry that quiet smile with you. The bees have been here all along, etched into the background, watching humans take themselves very seriously. And somehow, that feels perfectly on brand. You begin to notice how often bees survive what people don't. The thought arrives slowly, almost uninvited, as you hear stories told in low voices about years when fields failed, when sickness moved faster than prayer, when whole villages seemed to hold their breath for months at a time. Through all of it, the bees remain, sometimes reduced, sometimes scattered, but rarely gone entirely. One mainstream historical fact settles heavily here. During medieval plagues and famines, beekeeping often continues even as other agricultural systems falter. Bees don't depend on planted fields in the same way livestock and grain do. They forage widely, opportunistically, drawing from hedges, forests, and weeds that humans don't cultivate. In crisis, that flexibility matters. You walk through land that hasn't been properly tended in a while. Fences sag, fields lie fallow, and yet flowers still bloom. Thistles, wild herbs, blossoms no one planted deliberately. The bees don't care that the system has broken down. They adapt immediately. Nectar is nectar, survival is survival. There's a quiet, almost grim belief that bees know when death is coming. If a household succumbs to illness, people say the hives grow restless or fall silent. Historians still argue whether these stories emerged from genuine changes in care during crises or from the human need to assign meaning to overlapping losses. Watching the hives continue their steady hum while human voices fade, the belief feels understandable, even if it isn't literal. Honey becomes more important in these years, not less. It preserves food when fresh supplies are scarce. It soothes coughs when medicine runs out. Wax keeps candles burning when long nights stretch longer under fear. Bees offer continuity when routines collapse. Their labor doesn't stop because history gets ugly. You hear that in some regions people abandon fields but carry their hives with them when they flee. Bees are portable hope. Wherever they settle, sweetness might follow. There's debate here too. Historians still argue how often hives were truly relocated during crises versus how often bees simply recolonized abandoned areas naturally. Either way, bees reappear quickly where humans withdraw. As dusk settles over a half-empty village, you stand near a row of hives that seem almost too loud in the silence. The contrast is unsettling, life insisting on itself while everything else pauses. You feel both comforted and uneasy by it. Bees don't mourn. They don't remember plagues. They respond to flowers, temperature, and light. And yet, they become witnesses to human fragility simply by outlasting it. You take a slow breath and let the sound ground you. In the long arc of history, resilience doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it just hums quietly, waiting for someone to come back. You start sensing a shift. Not abrupt, not announced, but unmistakable once it's there. The way people talk about bees changes slightly. Not less respectful, not less careful, just more curious. Questions linger longer. Observations get compared instead of accepted. Somewhere along the line, watching quietly turns into wondering why. One mainstream historical fact anchors this moment of transition. By the late medieval period, natural philosophers and scholars begin moving away from purely symbolic interpretations of nature toward more observational approaches, including in beekeeping. It's not modern science yet, not even close, but it's a step. People start trusting what they see just a little more than what they've been told. You notice it in small things. Someone counts how long bees take to return from forage. Someone else compares honey yields from two hives placed differently. Notes are made, not systematic, not controlled, but intentional. The hive becomes less of a moral allegory and more of a system worth understanding on its own terms. There's still confusion, of course. The king bee idea hasn't vanished yet, but doubts creep in. Why does the hive collapse when the ruler is lost? Why does swarming align so closely with certain seasons? Why do some hives thrive while others fail under identical care? These questions don't overthrow tradition, but they poke at it gently, persistently. A quirky moment catches your attention. Someone opens a dead hive and actually looks, instead of immediately assigning blame to bad luck or sin. It feels radical in its quietness. Historians still argue whether such moments represent early scientific thinking or simply practical troubleshooting. But either way, something is changing. Curiosity is becoming respectable. Books begin circulating more widely now, carrying compiled observations rather than just inherited authority. Ancient texts are still revered, but they're no longer unquestioned. If Aristotle says one thing and the bees do another, people start whispering about it instead of forcing reality to comply. That whisper is the sound of transition. You realize that medieval beekeeping doesn't end because it's wrong. It fades because it works well enough to hand off to something more analytical. The skeps remain, the smoke remains, the patience remains. What changes is the framing. Bees shift from moral teachers to biological subjects, slowly, unevenly, and without ceremony. There's an open debate threaded through modern scholarship. Historians still argue whether medieval observational practices directly influenced early modern science, or whether they simply coexisted until new tools took over. Sitting here, it feels less like replacement and more like inheritance. You don't abandon gentleness when you gain knowledge, you build on it. As night falls, the hives sound the same as ever. The bees don't notice the shift. They don't care what era you think you're in. They keep doing what they've always done, providing a steady reference point while human understanding rearranges itself around them. You sit with that thought, feeling the slow handoff of centuries. The gentle science doesn't vanish, it evolves, carrying straw, smoke, and humility quietly forward. You find yourself back where you started, not physically, but emotionally, standing near a hive and realizing how little force is actually involved in this entire relationship. After everything you've seen, the tools, the rituals, the myths, the losses, what remains most clearly is not technique, but attitude. Medieval beekeeping doesn't conquer, it listens. The shift feels subtle but deliberate. Earlier, you watched people intervene when they had to, harvest, defend, relocate. Now you notice how often they simply don't. One mainstream historical fact settles in as the pattern becomes undeniable. Medieval beekeepers typically interfere far less with hives than modern practitioners, relying on observation, seasonal rhythm, and restraint rather than constant management. The hive leads, the human follows. You stand quietly and let the bees pass you without flinching. That reflex, don't flinch, feels earned now. You've learned that sudden movement creates problems faster than almost anything else. There's a small joke exchanged nearby about bees being the best teachers of self-control because they enforce consequences immediately and without negotiation. It's funny because it's true, and because everyone here has learned it the hard way at least once. A quirky bit of wisdom floats through conversation. Bees are said to know more than we do, but care less about telling us. Historians still argue whether such sayings reflect genuine humility toward nature or whether they conveniently excuse gaps in understanding. Standing here, it feels less like an excuse and more like a posture. You don't need to know everything to behave respectfully. You think back to all the moments when not acting saved a hive, not opening it in winter, not harvesting too much in autumn, not forcing a swarm to settle before it's ready. Control, you realize, often feels productive even when it's harmful. Medieval beekeeping survives because it resists that impulse more often than it gives in. There's a debate humming beneath modern interpretations. Historians still argue whether medieval practices should be praised for their sustainability or criticized for inefficiency and loss. But that framing feels off somehow. Efficiency assumes optimization as the goal. Here, continuity is the goal. Keeping bees alive at all across unpredictable years matters more than maximizing output in any single season. You watch a keeper pass by without stopping to check the hive, and you understand that this too is care. Trusting a system to function without constant oversight requires confidence born of experience. It also requires accepting that failure will still happen sometimes. Bees will leave, colonies will die, and no amount of control would have prevented every loss. The gentle science, you're realizing, isn't naive, it's restrained. It accepts limits and works within them. It treats bees as collaborators rather than machines, and in doing so, it shapes human behavior as much as insect survival. As the light softens and the hive's hum deepens into evening quiet, you feel something settle in yourself. You don't need to do anything right now. You just need to be present. The bees don't perform for you. They don't explain themselves. They simply continue. And in that continuation, you sense the inheritance medieval beekeeping leaves behind. Not a method, but a mindset. One that values listening over forcing, patience over precision, and gentleness not as weakness, but long-earned wisdom. You linger a little longer than necessary, because endings in this world are rarely abrupt. The bees don't stop. The hives don't empty. There's no final gesture that says, "This is over now." Instead, everything softens at the edges, as if the day itself is easing you toward rest. The light fades into that blue-gray hush where details blur, but sounds grow clearer. The hum from the hive is lower now, steadier, like breathing in sleep. You realize this is how medieval beekeeping has always closed its days, not with accomplishment, but with continuity. One mainstream historical fact settles gently here. For most medieval beekeepers, success is measured not by yield, but by whether the bees are still there tomorrow. Survival, not surplus, is the quiet metric. You think back over everything you've absorbed. The smoke that announces presence instead of dominance. The laws that chase flying insects with legal language and somehow make peace with losing. The women whose hands carry knowledge without footnotes. The monks who rely on bees to keep thought alive after sunset. None of it rushes. None of it insists. It all waits. There's a final quirky belief you hear as someone covers a hive against the coming chill. Bees, they say, remember kindness. Not in a human way, not with gratitude or affection, but in outcomes. Gentle keepers have calmer hives. Rough ones don't. Historians still argue whether this is cause, coincidence, or comforting story. But after everything you've seen, the distinction feels less important. Behavior shapes behavior. Attention shapes response. The last work of the day is small. A skep adjusted slightly. A stone placed to block wind. A word murmured, not for the bees exactly, but for the moment. These actions don't change the world dramatically. They keep it steady. And steadiness, you're learning, is no small thing. As night fully settles, the village pulls inward. Doors close. Fires dim. The bees remain outside, clustered, alive, warm through shared effort. You imagine them vibrating softly, converting stored honey into heat, into life, into another chance at morning. No drama, no symbolism required. You step back one final time and let the sound fade just enough to feel distance without loss. Medieval beekeeping doesn't end because nothing needs ending. The practice folds into tomorrow, and the next season, and the next century, quietly influencing how people think about work, care, and restraint long after the skeps themselves rot away. You carry that with you now. The sense that not everything valuable needs to be optimized, accelerated, or fully understood. Some things ask only to be noticed and treated gently. And with that thought settling like a final ember, the night holds you. The hum you've been listening to all this time grows softer now, not because it's gone, but because you no longer need to strain to hear it. The images loosen their edges. Straw becomes texture without detail. Smoke becomes warmth without scent. The bees become less distinct, more like a feeling than a sound. Your breathing slows to match that steady rhythm. Nothing is required of you. There are no hives to tend, no seasons to track, no choices to weigh. The world you've been walking through keeps going without your attention, and that's strangely comforting. Thoughts drift, then drift again like bees circling once before settling. You don't follow them. You let them land where they will. The day folds itself away, neat and complete, without needing commentary. If your mind wanders back to the garden, it does so gently. If it doesn't, that's fine too. Sleep doesn't ask for understanding, only permission. So let the quiet finish the work. Let the hum fade into rest. Let the night take over from here. End of script. Sweet dreams.